In 1893, as America panicked over gold, a fair standard quietly stopped being fair. Years later, a Manhattan index line shows an obligation marked "Retired Removed" with no public filing number, proof that something real was changed, off the record. This video is titled, "The Race for Power." Whoever controlled the gold in the Golden Age controlled the game, and the controversy is simple. The gold standard did not reward discipline, it rewarded position. Not because the rulebook lied, but because access to the reserve mattered more than the promise of equal convertibility. And the first piece of evidence is not a theory or a rumor. It is a surviving entry in a Manhattan recording index, dated November 3, 1895, where a gold-linked obligation is marked "Retired Removed" by reference to a schedule that carries no public filing number. The line exists, the closure is asserted, and the public trail that should explain it is missing. In the next minutes, we will prove how and why a system that looked uniform on paper could be navigated like a private corridor by those closest to gold and credit. To understand the weight of that single line, you have to return to the climate that made gold more than metal. The Panic of 1893 was not merely a market event. It was a public shock that turned convertibility into a national anxiety. When confidence collapses, people do not debate abstractions. They ask whether promises can be honored on demand. Under the gold standard, the promise was precise. Paper could be converted into gold, but the power was not evenly distributed because the ability to convert or to borrow against gold-adjacent collateral depended on who stood nearest to the machinery of liquidity. In the mid-1890s, the U.S. Treasury Gold Reserve was not a distant concept. It was a benchmark watched by financiers, politicians, and the press as a signal of whether the entire structure could hold. New York in this period did not merely host capital, it organized it. Wall Street banking houses and trust company networks were positioned where credit could be extended before panic became public language. Their advantage was not always visible in the newspapers because visibility itself carried risk. Reputations were assets. A banking name was collateral. The wrong headline could tighten credit faster than any formal policy. And in the Golden Age, society and finance were not separate spheres. They were the same rooms, the same dinners, the same boards, the same corridors of counsel. A system built on confidence learns to manage what the public is allowed to see. This is where the gold standard's fairness becomes a matter of perspective. On paper, $1 was one claim under one rule. In practice, there were claims that could be honored quickly because the claimant had a relationship, a line, a trustee, a correspondent, or a standing arrangement that turned waiting into priority. When gold becomes the language of solvency, timing becomes a weapon. Those who can move first do not look brave, they look prudent. Those who arrive late do not look cheated, they look unlucky. And that is how unequal access can masquerade as equal treatment without ever announcing itself. The historical record reflects this tension in what it emphasizes and what it reduces. The public story of the era favors speeches, policies, and visible transactions. The private reality is often preserved in administrative phrasing, short lines, procedural notations, and the careful absence of detail. A clerk's office in Manhattan is not glamorous, but it is where the official world admits in its own language that certain outcomes occurred. The entry dated November 3, 1895, does not tell us a dramatic story. It does something colder. It confirms that an obligation could be closed in form while its public explanation remained out of reach. And that is what makes this investigation necessary. Because if a liability can be retired without a public filing, that explains the transaction, then the question is not whether the gold standard had rules, it is whether the rules were experienced equally by those inside the networks and those outside them. If a ledger can close a gold obligation without a visible transaction, what do you think actually moved? Money, influence, or classification? Leave your view in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next file. If this intrigues you, leave a like. We will not start by claiming villains, and we will not start by inventing motives. We will start where the era left a footprint that it did not intend to advertise, in the institutional spaces that outlived the people they served. The Golden Age built monuments that still stand, but its most durable architecture was often administrative, definitions, categories, and forms that could shift burdens without a public scene. The proof, when it survives, rarely announces itself as proof. It sits quietly among volumes meant to look ordinary. So, as we enter this story, keep one image in mind: a heavy index book in a Manhattan office, its margins worn by routine, a single line under dated handwriting asserting closure. Retired, removed. And beside it, the empty space where a public filing number should have been. On November 3rd, 1895, the kind of proof that rarely survives in dramatic form survives in the most unglamorous place: a line in a public-facing index. Not a speech, not a memoir, not a scandal sheet. An entry that exists because it had to be recorded, and yet reads as though it was written to avoid being understood by anyone outside the room that produced it. The setting is not symbolic, it is procedural. The New York County Clerk's office in Manhattan is where instruments are logged, cross-referenced, and made searchable in the language of the county. In that world, an obligation does not become real when people talk about it. It becomes real when it is indexed. Names, dates, and brief notations are how the city tells itself what exists and what has been closed. The public does not need to understand the terms to feel the effect. Credit decisions, reputations, and disputes move on the assumption that the ledger is faithful. The entry dated November 3rd, 1895 sits inside that culture of faith. Its structure is familiar in form: an indexed reference, a notation of status, and a pointer that should allow the record to be followed. And then, inside that familiar form, a detail appears that does not belong there. The obligation is treated as if it has been concluded. It is marked retired, removed. In the plain administrative language of a county office, that is not an opinion. It is a statement of outcome. Something that existed has been closed, withdrawn, or extinguished in the record's own terms. But the entry does not point where an entry like this is supposed to point. Instead of a clean public instrument number, instead of a filing trail that leads to a recorded satisfaction, a release, a settlement, an assignment, or a formal discharge that can be traced by anyone with patience, the reference points to something that is both precise and unreachable. A private schedule, a schedule described as if it were an annex, an internal attachment, a supporting sheet used by a trustee or a trust department to carry terms that are not meant to circulate. The index behaves as though this schedule exists in the same universe as recorded filings, and yet it provides no public filing number for it. No instrument identifier that would allow a reader to follow the trail through the county's own system. The pointer is not absent, it is present in the wrong format. That is the discovery. Not what it means, but what it is. The entry effectively tells two truths at once. First, that an obligation connected to gold collateral, the language suggests a relationship to reserves, to accommodation, to the kinds of instruments that mattered when convertibility and confidence were currency, was treated as formally closed. Second, that the closure is supported, at least on paper, by an internal schedule, that the public index will acknowledge without giving the public the means to retrieve. The record declares an outcome while withholding the publicly legible path to the document that would normally justify that outcome. What makes this stand out is not that private schedules existed. In late 19th century finance, internal schedules and annexes were common in the management of trust estates. Syndicate arrangements, custodial accounts, and the quiet administration of complex holdings. The problem is the collision of worlds. A county index is a public map. It is not supposed to rely on private rooms to explain public outcomes. When it does, it creates a condition that should not exist in a system designed to be referential, a claim of finality without a public anchor. And because this is Manhattan, that absence is not a romantic gap. It is operational. A missing filing number is not a missing anecdote. It is a missing coordinate. Without it, a reader can confirm that the clerk's office recorded the status change, but cannot confirm the terms, the consideration, the method, or the category shift that produced it. A dispute cannot be fully argued from the index alone. A creditor cannot easily test whether a settlement was paid, assumed, offset, exchanged, or otherwise converted into a different legal form. A journalist can repeat the phrase, retired, removed, but cannot responsibly claim the mechanism because the mechanism in the public system is not there. This is why the entry is more than an oddity. It is a surviving artifact of a boundary. It shows the line between what could be safely recorded and what could not be allowed to become a fully public chain. It shows that the county's record-keeping system, at least in this instance, accepted a reference that behaves like a citation while denying the reader access to the cited material. That is not a theory. That is the literal function of an index, to point. Here it points into a locked room. The phrasing, retired, removed, is itself a small discipline of language. It avoids explanation. It does not say paid. It does not say settled. It does not say discharged upon consideration received, nor does it say converted or assumed. It declares outcome without choosing a story. It performs closure as classification. In the world of clerks and trustees, that matters. The record can treat the item as no longer active without committing the office to an explanation that might invite questions. And the reference to a trust department context, implicit in the idea of a schedule tied to custodial administration, places the entry in the institutional environment that most benefited from controlled visibility. A trust department does not exist to create narratives. It exists to preserve assets, manage liabilities, and keep the machinery turning without provoking unnecessary attention. When public confidence is fragile, attention has a cost. And in the aftermath of 1893, attention was not neutral. It could become a run, a lawsuit, a reputational fracture, a forced liquidation. The index entry does not describe those risks. It does not need to. It was written in a world where everyone in the relevant tier already understood them. So we are left with a rare kind of proof, not a confession, but a footprint. The footprint says an obligation existed. It was closed. The record acknowledges that closure, and the supporting reference is private in a way the public system cannot follow. That alone is enough to justify the investigation, because if control of gold operated as structural advantage, you would expect to find moments where outcomes are recorded while pathways are narrowed, where the world is told that a liability is finished, but not allowed to see the terms under which it was finished. At this stage, we do not claim who authored the schedule, who benefited, or what was exchanged. We do not need to. The discovery is that the county's own index has preserved a contradiction, an officially recorded conclusion attached to an unofficial citation. It is the kind of contradiction that persists only when it is considered safe. Safe enough to remain as an administrative trace, unsafe enough to prevent ordinary retrieval. And that brings us to the practical question the entry forces upon anyone who reads it carefully. If a public ledger can mark a gold-linked obligation, retired, removed, while pointing to a schedule that cannot be publicly located, then the power in this story will not be found in a dramatic theft. It will be found in the systems that decide what counts as a public record and what is permitted to remain only as a private attachment acknowledged from a distance. The last detail worth noticing is the physical character of the record itself. Index books in county offices were built for repetition. They were meant to be used, not admired. Their authority came from routine, which means this entry did not survive because someone wanted it to be discovered. It survived because it looked sufficiently ordinary to be left alone. A line, a date, a status, a reference that appears compliant at a glance. The block ends where the evidence ends, with that line sitting on the page, the ink slightly uneven, the notation retired, removed, resting beside a reference to a private schedule that the public cannot pull, an outcome stated as fact, and a pathway withheld as procedure. To understand why a single index line in Manhattan could matter more than a public statement, you have to step back into the narrow window between 1893 and 1895, when the country learned, again, that finance is not governed by ideals. It is governed by confidence, and confidence is governed by who can convert, who can borrow, and who can wait. After the Panic of 1893, the gold standard was still presented as a neutral rule. But inside the system, neutrality was not how survival was allocated. The panic did not begin as a philosophical dispute about money. It moved through practical mechanisms that the public could feel without naming. Credit tightened. Depositors became sensitive to rumors. Railroads, still the spine of American expansion and the largest field for leverage, entered reorganization, receivership, and forced restructuring. That was not a distant corporate drama. In the Golden Age, a railroad's stress radiated outward, to banks that held its paper, to trusts that had underwritten its issues, to merchants whose contracts depended on its lines, to households whose savings sat in institutions exposed to its collateral. The public watched prices and headlines. Inside New York, institutions watched something colder: liquidity and convertibility. In that environment, gold was not a slogan. It was a gate. The U.S. Treasury Gold Reserve functioned like a national pressure gauge. When reserves were questioned, confidence was questioned. And when confidence was questioned, the difference between a solvent institution and a dead one became timing. The gold standard promised that paper could become gold, but it did not promise that conversion would be smooth for everyone at once. The promise looked equal in print. The cue was not equal in practice, and the reason was structural. Proximity to reserves and the networks of credit determined who could move early and who was forced to move late. This is where New York banking houses come into focus, not as villains, but as the operators of a system that rewarded position. Banking houses did not simply lend money. They organized syndicates, they managed placements, they controlled relationships that determined whether a borrower would be treated as credible in a stressed market. They held the kind of information that arrives before it becomes news. And after 1893, the market treated gold access as proof of institutional strength, not because everyone loved the metal, but because gold was the one asset that behaved like an unquestioned instrument in a world where everything else was negotiable. Trust companies and banks responded to that climate by hardening their behavior, not their rhetoric. They reinforced collateral requirements. They issued margin calls and re-evaluated pledges. They demanded better paper, shorter terms, more reliable security. They widened spreads. They became selective in who could roll obligations and who would be forced to settle. Those actions were not emotional, they were mechanical, but their social consequences were enormous. A borrower could be perfectly viable on a long horizon and still fail in a short one. That is what a panic teaches. Solvency is not enough if liquidity is withheld, and the institutions best positioned to withhold or extend liquidity were those closest to the circuitry of the city. In the mid-1890s, railroad finance circles were not a niche. They were a central theater of American credit. Railroads carried massive fixed costs, depended on continuous financing, and were vulnerable to shifts in demand and confidence. When trouble came, the response was rarely a simple default and liquidation. It was reorganization. It was a committee. It was a syndicate. It was a new instrument issued to replace an old one. Those restructurings were often framed as discipline necessity, but the ability to survive them depended on who could obtain accommodation, who could secure a bridge, an extension, a conversion that preserved continuity. That is why gold convertibility became, in practice, a marker of social solvency, not just financial solvency. In a stable period, convertibility is a background rule. In a stressed period, convertibility is a test. If your institution could meet it, or was believed to be able to meet it, you maintained the confidence that kept deposits in place and credit lines open. If you could not, or if doubt spread, you became vulnerable not only to market pressure but to reputation collapse. In the Golden Age, reputation could move faster than documentation. A whisper could tighten terms. A headline could empty accounts. And those who managed reputations managed risk. The press mattered because it did not merely report the economy. It shaped what safe meant to the public. In New York, newspapers turned financial rumor into civic mood. They gave language to fear. They made runs rational by making them visible. Institutions, therefore, had an incentive to avoid anything that could be framed as weakness or impropriety. A visible settlement could be spun. A visible restructuring could be interpreted as distress. A visible admission that an obligation had been handled privately, especially one connected to gold collateral or reserve accommodation, could raise the exact question the system could not afford at the wrong moment: who is being rescued and who is not? That is the context in which certain administrative behaviors become understandable without being excused. When the system is fragile, visibility becomes a kind of exposure. An institution may prefer a quiet solution, not because the solution is illegitimate, but because public legibility creates second-order risks, a line of questioning, a cascade of demand. A sudden shift in counterparties' willingness to roll paper, a creditor's decision to litigate rather than negotiate. And the Golden Age was a time when litigation itself could be a weapon of reputation. Courts did not merely decide outcomes, they made disputes public. They pulled names into the record. They forced disclosure through procedure. A settlement that remained procedurally private could preserve stability in the short term and preserve power in the long term. The practical reality was that gold access and credit access were not evenly distributed because credit itself was not evenly priced. Networks mattered, standing mattered, relationships mattered. An institution with the right correspondence could secure accommodation earlier and cheaper. A borrower with the right sponsorship could roll obligations that others would be forced to redeem at the worst moment. A firm with the right trustees could move liabilities into forms that were easier to carry through stress. Meanwhile, those outside the circle faced blunt choices: sell assets into a thin market, accept punitive terms, enter receivership, or be diluted in reorganizations they could not influence. So when we say, "Who controls the gold?" controls the game, the phrase is not an exaggeration. It is a description of how priority is created when a system is under strain. Control did not always mean literal possession of bars. It meant influence over reserves, over credit creation, over the definitions of acceptable collateral, over the willingness to extend time. In a gold standard world, time is not neutral. Time is granted by lenders, by trustees, by syndicate managers, by committees. And time determines who looks stable and who becomes a casualty of arithmetic. This is why the index line we found in Manhattan, dated November 3, 1895, cannot be treated as a trivial clerical oddity. It appears at the end of a period when institutions were rearranging exposures, hardening credit, and managing reputational risk with the same care they managed balance sheets. A notation of retired removed tied to a private schedule sits exactly where the era's incentives would place it. After the panic, during the tightening, in a climate where public legibility could produce instability, and where the difference between an orderly conclusion and a public controversy was often the method of recording. And there is a second, quieter consequence that grows from this context. Once the public learns that outcomes can be reached without visible pathways, trust becomes asymmetric. Those inside the system still trust it because they understand the mechanisms. Those outside trust it only until the system's results feel inconsistent with the rhetoric. That mismatch is the seed of long-term skepticism, and it is also the reason the era's record-keeping becomes so important. Because when the rule is fair in principle but uneven in operation, the only way to demonstrate the unevenness decades later is to find the institutional traces, the lines that admit closure without explaining it. We are now positioned to move from broad climate to narrow mechanism. We have the period, we have the incentives, we have the pressure points. Gold. Reserve anxiety, credit tightening, reorganizations, reputational fragility, and the strategic value of controlling what becomes legible. The next step is not to accuse. It is to locate the moment where the system stops behaving like a public chain and starts behaving like a curated corridor, where a classification choice is made behind professional doors and then reflected outward as a finished fact. The last image of this block is not a panic scene or a crowd. It is quieter and therefore more accurate. A midtown office building after hours, a law desk cleared except for a folded memorandum, and a ledger entry in a county index that declares "retired removed" while pointing to a schedule the public cannot pull. Because in the Golden Age, power often looked exactly like that, calm on the surface, decisive in private, and final in the record. By February 8, 1895, the question inside certain rooms in New York was no longer whether the gold standard was fair. The question was whether a particular obligation could remain visible without becoming dangerous. After 1893, danger did not always arrive as insolvency. It arrived as a tension. A liability that could be explained slowly was one thing. A liability that could be interpreted quickly by competitors, creditors, or the press was another. The surviving traces suggest that this was the moment when the problem stopped being treated as a balance to be paid and began to be treated as a classification to be managed. The setting, implied by the record, is consistent with how these choices were made in the Golden Age, not in public offices, but through council and committees whose purpose was to prevent public friction. The named locus is a Fifth Avenue law office, the sort of place where the city's formal language was drafted before it ever entered a ledger. The other named actor is a trust company committee, a small group of trustees and council whose authority was not theatrical but administrative. They did not exist to invent outcomes. They existed to decide what the system would call an outcome and which parts of that outcome would become legible outside the institution. What matters here is not an imagined scene of smoke and melodrama. It is the administrative mechanics of a meeting that produces a decision with record consequences. A committee receives a problem, an obligation linked to gold collateral or reserve accommodation, a category of exposure that, in the post-1893 climate, touched confidence. Directly, the committee also receives a constraint. Anything that reads like an ordinary payoff, paid in full, satisfied, settled, can create questions the institution cannot control. Where did the funds come from? Who provided the accommodation? Why was this obligation treated differently from others? Even the appearance of special treatment can be a liability if it becomes legible at the wrong time. So the decision that emerges is deliberately technical. The obligation will not be framed as paid, at least not in the way the public expects to see it. It will be treated as assumed offset by arrangement. That phrase does not deny closure. It provides closure without the public grammar of a transaction. It suggests that something has been accounted for, but it does not invite the reader into the terms. It allows the institution to treat the exposure as removed from the active category, debt payable, a visible line that might be questioned, and place it into a form that can be carried elsewhere, a set-off, an assumption, an internal arrangement that satisfies the institution's accounting and governance needs without becoming a public narrative. This is the essence of the decision. The system chooses to change how the obligation exists rather than prove that it ended by a conventional exchange of money. That is not a dramatic claim, it is a recognizable administrative pattern. When an institution cannot afford a visible explanation, it prefers a form that ends questions rather than answers them. Assumed implies that someone else now carries it, but the identity can remain inside trustee correspondence. Offset implies that it has been netted against something else, but the pairing can remain inside internal schedules. By arrangement implies authorization, but it does not reveal terms. The language is a closure device. The action authorized in the meeting follows naturally. Counsel is empowered to redraw the paper trail, not to forge reality, but to reframe it in a way that is compatible with institutional survival. In a Fifth Avenue law office, that would mean drafting or revising instruments so that the visible record contains only the minimum necessary assertion of status, while the operative detail is displaced into attachments and schedules used by a trust department. The decision does not require a lie, it requires a controlled distribution of specificity. The public sees that an obligation has changed state. The institution retains the terms. The boundary between public and private becomes the mechanism of risk management. There is a reason this approach fits the period of 1893-1895 so closely. After the panic, credit was not merely money, it was permission. Permission to roll a note, permission to maintain a pledge, permission to avoid being forced into liquidation or receivership. Those permissions were granted through networks, banking houses, trust departments, council, committees. In a world where the press could turn a technical event into a confidence shock, committees learned to treat visibility as a variable. This is why convertibility became social solvency, because people were not only watching who had gold, they were watching who appeared to have uninterrupted access to it. Anything that disrupted that appearance could change counterparty behavior, which could change an institution's fate. The committee's decision to treat the obligation as a classification event, assumed, offset, arranged, also functions as a defense against the most predictable danger, creditors who might test whether they were treated equally. If an obligation is publicly paid, creditors can ask whether the payment preference violated norms or agreements. If an obligation is assumed or offset, the question becomes technical and slower. It migrates into documentation that is harder to litigate quickly and harder to explain in a headline. The decision buys time. And in a liquidity-driven system, time is not an accessory, it is the currency. The consequence in the real world is immediate and structural. Once the obligation is redefined, the institution can remove it from the category that is most visible in ordinary record-keeping. It can be carried in a trust department file rather than in the public chain. It can be referenced by schedule rather than by instrument number. It can be closed in the index without producing the kind of public filing that would typically anchor a closure. The record will still show that a change occurred because records must show outcomes, but the record will not necessarily show why in a way that is legible to outsiders. This is how the decision anticipates the November 3rd, 1895 index entry we already have. An index line that marks an obligation retired, removed while pointing to a private schedule is not an accident of paperwork. It is exactly the kind of outcome a classification decision makes possible. The committee decides, council drafts, the trust department implements, and the county office receives only what it needs to receive, enough to mark a status change, not enough to illuminate the mechanism. And it is important to note what this decision is not. It is not, at least at this stage, proof of illegality. It is proof of institutional preference, a preference for controlled legibility, a preference for outcomes that cannot be easily contested by those who do not have access to the same rooms. In the Golden Age, power did not always present itself as force. It presented itself as procedure, quietly, formally, with signatures and committee minutes that could be filed away rather than argued in public. The final consequence is reputational as much as it is financial. By choosing classification over demonstration, the institution protects the story it must tell the world. Stability. It preserves the appearance of clean closure. It avoids the kind of public transaction that can be reframed as distress. It keeps alliances intact by keeping the mechanism unattributed, and it reduces the likelihood that the press, rivals, or creditors can reduce the event into a simple accusation. The obligation becomes a technical matter, and technical matters are easier to bury under the dignity of paperwork. This block ends with a concrete image because in this era, decisions are not remembered by their speeches, they are remembered by their artifacts. A committee room in a Fifth Avenue office, the kind with heavy doors and a long table, a short memorandum prepared for trustees, a council's authorization written in restrained legal language, and somewhere downstream, a clerk's index line that will one day state the outcome in plain ink: retired, removed, while pointing calmly and without apology toward a private schedule that the public was never meant to see. The decision made in early February 1895 could not remain a decision. In the Golden Age, a committee's intent had to be converted into paper that could survive clerks, counter-signatures, and time. Otherwise, it was only a preference spoken inside a room. By April 22, 1895, that conversion appears to have occurred in the form that mattered most, a shift in language that changed where the obligation lived, and therefore who could see it, trace it, and contest it. The object here is not a sensational document. It is an instrument shaped to look routine, a trust indenture amendment drafted to be compatible with county recording practice. That compatibility is the key detail. County offices were built to index what was presented in recognizable form. They were not built to interrogate what was intentionally displaced into attachments. A careful amendment could therefore accomplish something powerful without ever appearing dramatic. It could keep the public record technically intact while relocating the operative meaning elsewhere. The action, in plain terms, is a swap of verbs. This is not metaphor. It is the actual method by which liabilities move through a paper system, where an obligation would normally be framed in the familiar language of repayment or redemption. The amendment substitutes language that implies closure without the public mechanics of closure, set-off, assumption, exchange into new instruments. Each term carries a different legal posture, and each has a practical consequence for record visibility. Repayment is legible. It invites the question of funds. Redemption is legible. It invites the question of price, timing, and who received value. Both tend to generate public anchors, satisfactions, releases, recorded discharges that connect the end of the obligation to an event that can be described as money-moving. Set-off behaves differently. It does not require a public transaction in the same way because it frames the resolution as internal netting, one obligation balanced against another, one claim offset by a counterclaim or an arrangement of accounts. The mechanism can be real and yet remain structurally hard to narrate from the outside because it is embedded in a pairing that may be documented privately rather than in a single public instrument. Assumption behaves differently as well. It changes the identity of who carries the obligation without necessarily producing a public payment. The obligation can be treated as no longer belonging to the original path that outsiders expect to follow. The question becomes, assumed by whom, under what terms, and with what security? Those answers often reside in trustee correspondence and schedules rather than in a clean filing. Exchange into new instruments is the most elegant displacement of all because it allows continuity of value without continuity of the same record trail. The old obligation is not paid in the public sense, it is transformed. It becomes something else, a substituted certificate, a reissued note under different covenants, a claim folded into a new structure with different indexing logic. The Golden Age. This was not exotic. It was ordinary in reorganizations and trust administration. What becomes unusual is when the exchange is crafted to remove the event from the line of sight of the most common public pathways. This is why an amendment is the right vehicle. An amendment can declare that certain obligations are now treated under revised terms, and it can do so while referring readers to attachments for detail. Those attachments, schedules, annexes, internal lists, are where specificity goes to disappear without being destroyed. The county record may show that an amendment exists. It may even include a summary of the change. But it is not required to carry the full operational story, and often cannot. The county's function is to record, not to expose. So the alteration is not the creation of a false outcome. It is a deliberate relocation of legibility, a liability that was once expected to travel through the public chain, instrument number, satisfaction, discharge, now travels through a corridor that the public can recognize but cannot enter. Amendment language that gestures toward completion while directing the real terms into private schedules and trustee annexes. The consequence in the real world is immediate and measurable, even if the public cannot measure it at the time. Once repayment is swapped for set-off, the trail a creditor expects begins to fail. Once redemption is swapped for assumption, the identity that the public would attach to the obligation becomes unstable. Once the obligation is framed as an exchange into new instruments, the obligation stops being the same object in the eyes of record-keeping. It becomes a successor, a transformed claim, a reclassified exposure. And reclassification is the point. The liability does not have to vanish. It has to stop being traceable through the familiar route. This also explains why the later index line, retired, removed, can coexist with the absence of a public filing that narrates payment. The public record can be fed a status outcome because the status outcome is supported by an internal accounting and trustee logic that has been moved out of the main channel. The public ledger sees the end state. It does not see the root. That is not an accident of bureaucracy. It is the intended product of language selection. The county recording practice matters here because county systems have a predictable weakness. They rely on form. If an instrument is presented in a recognized format, it can be entered. If an instrument refers to schedules that are not recorded in full, the county can still log the existence of the instrument while leaving the operative material beyond public reach. This is how a system can remain proper while becoming selectively opaque. It does not require collusion from a clerk. It requires that counsel understands the edge of what must be recorded and uses that edge as a boundary. There is another layer to the alteration that becomes visible when you consider reputation. Paid and redeemed are words that imply a visible act of strength, but they can also imply the possibility of weakness. Why did this need to be redeemed now, under pressure? Assumed, offset, and exchanged are words that imply administrative order rather than distress. They shift the narrative from "we found money" to "we arranged classification." In a post-1893 environment where the press could translate transactions into anxiety, administrative language was safer than transactional language. It offered closure without inviting the public to imagine a scramble. And because this is the Golden Age, it is also about inheritance and standing. A public satisfaction can attach names to events. It creates a clean anchor for rival interpretation. A carefully drafted amendment can end the public inquiry at the level of procedure. An amendment exists. Terms have been adjusted. The rest is by arrangement. It keeps the end of the U. Story in a place where the public is not invited to read past the caption. The alteration then is not merely linguistic, it is a change in how reality is allowed to appear. The liability's existence shifts from a public instrument chain to a trust administration chain. The visible record becomes a signpost. The operative record becomes a file. The public is shown a door. The key is held elsewhere. What makes this block advance the investigation is that it converts the prior topic's decision into a material mechanism. You can now see how a closed-room choice becomes a public outcome without a public pathway. The committee authorizes counsel. Counsel drafts an amendment that swaps the verbs. The verbs control where the details go. The details migrate to schedules, and the county record doing its job logs the change without carrying the full structure. In the end, the obligation does not disappear as a matter of arithmetic. It disappears as a matter of routing. The consequence is also legal, not only archival. Once the obligation is routed into private schedules and trustee annexes, any attempt to challenge the outcome becomes slower and narrower. A creditor may know something changed, but not what. A rival may sense advantage, but cannot quote terms. The public may see stability, but cannot verify equal treatment. The very architecture of documentation becomes a defense. This block ends with a specific image because this is what the alteration produces in practice. AC thick amendment page, dated April 22, 1895, bearing formal signatures and careful clauses, recorded in a way that satisfies county form, while the real movement of the liability, the pairing, the assumption, the exchange, sits behind it on a referenced schedule, a private attachment, an annex in a trustee's file that the public index will later acknowledge only by pointing toward a place it cannot reach. By 1895-1896, the question of who benefited can be answered without naming a single villain, because the benefit was produced by structure. The gold standard did not reward virtue, it rewarded position. It rewarded proximity to reserves and proximity to the people allowed to treat access as a classification rather than a transaction. Once you understand what the April 1895 language swap accomplished, moving an obligation out of the public channel into trustee logic, the beneficiary becomes visible in the only way this era allows, not as a face in a headline, but as a class of actors who could pass through gates the rest of the market could not even see. The named entities that matter here are not decorative. They are operational. Trust departments were the nerve centers of control because they sat at the junction between private wealth and public institutions. They were staffed to administer instruments, hold collateral, execute conversions, and maintain correspondence that never had to become public. Private counsel networks were the second hinge. They were the translators of intent into enforceable language, and they moved comfortably between Fifth Avenue offices, club rooms, board committees, and the desks where recording choices were made. And the third entity is a milieu rather than a corporation. The Fifth Avenue wealth environment, the old money ecosystem where reputation was treated as a form of credit, and where credit in a gold regime could be converted into survival. The action in this block is concrete and repeatable. Insiders operated with structural advantage in three connected ways: cheaper credit, priority in conversion, and the capacity to wait. Cheaper credit here does not mean generous interest rates in a modern sense. It means access to lines and accommodations that were priced not just by risk, but by relationship and collateral quality, and by who could call a trust department and be taken seriously. Priority in conversion does not mean a formal queue posted on a wall. It means that when convertibility became scarce, when gold became anxiety, some entities could act early because they were already inside the network of counsel, trustees, and banking houses that defined what would be treated as liquidity. Capacity to wait is the most decisive advantage of all. In a panic's aftermath, waiting is power because it prevents forced sale. If you can wait, you can hold. If you can hold, you do not have to disclose weakness. If you do not disclose weakness, you preserve credit. And preserving credit is preserving your future. This is the beneficiary's hidden mechanism, the ability to avoid becoming public. Publicness was often the event that killed firms, not the underlying assets, not always even the underlying numbers. The moment the wrong story reached the wrong audience, credit could be repriced overnight. Depositors could retreat. Counterparties could demand collateral. Newspapers could turn a technical adjustment into a moral narrative. And in the Golden Age, moral narratives had market consequences because they could be weaponized by rivals and creditors. To see who benefited, you follow the path of the alteration. Once a liability is reclassified through trustee language, set-off, assumption, exchange, its resolution can be administered within a trust department without producing an ordinary public trail. That means the beneficiary is any actor whose position allows them to close exposures without inviting public explanation. It includes those who could move obligations into schedules, those who could accept an arrangement without requiring a public term sheet, and those whose solvency was treated as a social premise rather than a contestable fact. The action becomes visible in small, sober behaviors. A trust department receives an amended instrument and treats the obligation as no longer belonging to the original category. A council drafts the documentation so the county record receives the minimum necessary form. A banking house extends accommodation under terms that do not need to be explained to strangers. A counterpart accepts a reclassification rather than demanding a public payoff. Each act is administratively normal. The combined effect is not normal. It produces unequal survival, and once unequal survival is produced, the consequence is measurable in holdings and influence. The beneficiary preserves holdings because they do not liquidate at the bottom. That is not an emotional claim. It is mechanical. Forced liquidation transfers assets. If you are forced to liquidate, you become the seller when sellers are punished. If you are not forced to liquidate, you can become the buyer when prices collapse. The gold standard, in practice, amplified this difference because access to reserves and credit determined whether you were forced. The public story presented the system as uniform. The lived system distributed timing advantages: who could convert, who could borrow, who could endure calls. This is why the phrase "arrived early" matters. In a panic's wake, there is always a line. The line is not just at a bank teller's window. It is the line of who receives accommodation first, who rolls their obligations, who can satisfy collateral demands without selling, who gets to treat the crisis as a temporary inconvenience rather than a terminal event. If you hold the gate through trust administration, counsel networks, and reputational credit, you arrive early. If you arrive early, you stabilize yourself and destabilize others, because liquidity is not infinite and confidence is not evenly distributed. The outsider's experience is not that they were immoral or incompetent. It is that they were late by design. They faced higher costs because they were priced as unknown or exposed. They faced stricter terms because they lacked the networks that allowed discretion. They faced sudden calls because their liabilities remained legible and therefore targetable. They were forced into receivership not because their assets vanished, but because their time vanished, and time vanishes fastest for those who cannot negotiate classification. This is the crucial consequence of beneficiary structure. It preserves not just wealth, but reputation. A Fifth Avenue household or an old money circle does not only protect dollars, it protects narrative continuity. If your exposures can be resolved through private schedules, your public story remains clean. If your public story remains clean, you keep access to clubs, boards, committees, and underwriting relationships. That access becomes future credit. The beneficiary therefore gains twice, once in preserved holdings and again in preserved standing that keeps future accommodations available. The effect can even be institutional. Trust departments that successfully manage delicate obligations gain prestige and more business. Counsel networks that demonstrate discretion become more central. Banking houses that avoid public embarrassment preserve their ability to syndicate and lead. The beneficiary is not a single actor. It is the ecosystem that becomes stronger when the public cannot see what it is doing. In a system that relies on confidence, invisibility is not merely concealment. It is a form of governance. None of this requires theatrical conspiracy. It requires ordinary coordination among entities that already work together. In the Golden Age, the lines between legal work, trust administration, club relationships, and financial accommodation were not separate realms. They were a single circuit, and the beneficiary is whoever sits inside that circuit, because they can convert uncertainty into paperwork rather than into panic. There is a final detail that anchors this beneficiary logic to the record you already have. When the Manhattan Index later marks something "retired removed" while pointing to a private schedule, it does not merely confirm closure. It confirms that closure happened in a way that privileges those who can operate through private files. An outsider cannot. An outsider has to close obligations in the open, where terms become legible and therefore contestable. An insider can close them through structure, where the terms remain inside the trustee's world. The tension resolved in this block is simple and harsh. The gold standard did not merely measure wealth, it measured access. The beneficiary was the class of actors who could treat access as procedure. The preparation for what comes next is equally concrete. If this structure benefited insiders, it also created a risk. If the mechanism ever became legible, if the public could see how liabilities were moved and who had priority, confidence would not just wobble, it would break. And that is why the next trace we have to examine is not another victory, but a protective reflex. The way institutions react when the possibility of exposure comes too close. The image that closes this block is not a dramatic scene. It is an ordinary one that carries the whole era's truth. A trust department clerk sliding a thin file into a cabinet marked correspondence, while outside, a smaller firm sells assets at a discount to meet a call it cannot delay. Two worlds operating in the same city, in the same year, under the same fair system, but separated by a gate that most people were never allowed to approach. In 1896, the most fragile asset in New York was not gold. It was confidence, and confidence was not an abstraction. It was a pricing mechanism, a social verdict, and a legal weapon all at once. After the panic of 1893, people learned to watch the Treasury's reserve figures the way they watched the weather, because a run did not need a fire to start. It needed a rumor with the right timing. In that climate, any arrangement that made a liability disappear without a visible transaction did not merely create suspicion. It threatened the system's ability to keep operating without being interrogated. The risk begins with the way the story could be. Read by the wrong audience, a trust department and a council network could treat an obligation as a matter of classification, but the broader public would not. To a newspaper, to a creditor, or to a rival banking house, retired, removed with no public filing, would not look like technical elegance. It would look like a private settlement. And in the Golden Age, private settlement was a phrase that carried its own danger. It implied unequal treatment. It implied access. It implied a gate, and the existence of a gate was always more scandalous than the existence of a debt. The named entities here are blunt because the threat was blunt. New York newspapers did not need full documentation to construct a narrative. They needed a pattern. A single index line at the New York County Clerk's office could be enough, not because it proved wrongdoing, but because it suggested a story that readers already suspected, that rules were uniform in speech and selective in practice. And the state. Oversight climate in the mid-1890s was not an empty backdrop. Even when regulation was uneven, the threat of inquiries, legislative hearings, or court-ordered discovery was real. The more the public worried about money, the more officials felt compelled to be seen responding to it. The action in this block is a plausible projection grounded in how the era worked. If the mechanism became legible, it would have been framed, exploited, and litigated. Not necessarily in that order, but often all at once. The press would frame it first because framing is cheap. Rivals would exploit it because reputational damage is leverage. Creditors would litigate it because litigation forces exposure. Imagine the pathway. The first exposure is not a confession, it is an accident of attention. A reporter hears a phrase, gold collateral or reserve accommodation, connected to a retired obligation that has no public equivalent. That reporter does not need to understand trustee schedules. They only need to Ask why a public index points to a private reference. The headline does not have to accuse. In 1896, it only has to imply a quiet arrangement, a closed-room settlement, a special treatment. Those words, printed on paper and passed hand to hand, would have done their work. Once the story is printed, the second action occurs almost automatically. Rivals begin to speak. Not publicly at first, privately, through the same council networks and club rooms that made the system function. The beneficiary class understands something the public does not, that reputation is not simply social, it is collateral. If a banking house is believed to have received special treatment, its deals become easier to question and harder to price. Rivals could pressure counterparties by suggesting that the house's stability depended on private accommodations. They could push depositors towards safer names. They could force the target to overpay for credit or pledge more collateral to silence doubts. The third action is the creditor's response, and this is where the risk becomes institutional. A creditor does not need moral outrage to act. A creditor needs leverage. If there is any chance that a liability was resolved through reclassification rather than repayment, then the creditor's first move is not necessarily to call it fraud. The move is to demand legibility. In legal terms, that means discovery, requests for correspondence, trustee schedules, side letters, committee minutes, anything that shows the mechanism. Courts did not have to be modern to be dangerous. The mere process of compelled production could drag private files into the open, or at least threaten to. And the threat of discovery changes behavior before a single page is produced. Allies recede, not because they suddenly become virtuous, but because association becomes costly. In the Golden Age, alliances were not only financial, they were social and political. A trust company committee might decide to distance itself from a client. A prominent council might decline to sign new papers. A banking house might pause accommodations, not to punish, but to protect its own standing. The risk is contagious because it is reputational. If a scandal attaches to one name, it can smear the network that made the arrangement possible. This is how confidence breaks in a system built on confidence. It does not break because the assets are gone. It breaks because the story changes. The public story of the gold standard was that it was uniform, rule-bound, and stabilizing. The lived story, if the mechanism became legible, would be that convertibility and accommodation were distributed by proximity, and that proximity could be engineered through private paperwork. Once that story takes hold, the market begins to reprice not just one firm, but the credibility of categories, trust departments, banking houses, even the implied fairness of convertibility. The consequence becomes real in measurable ways. Credit spreads widen. Calls become faster, collateral standards tighten. The line becomes harsher for anyone whose name is not already treated as safe. Depositors and smaller financiers do not need to understand the mechanism to react to the atmosphere. In 1896, money could flee on tone alone. It could flee because the public senses that certain people can close obligations without showing how. And if that is true, then the public must assume the system will protect insiders first. The oversight climate intensifies. Officials may not know the full details, but they understand political pressure. If newspapers frame the story as private settlement under a supposedly fair monetary regime, the state has to appear attentive. That can mean inquiries into recording practices, questions about county indexing, or scrutiny of trust company processes. The record-keeping system becomes part of the controversy, and that is the most dangerous escalation of all, because it turns a private arrangement into a question about institutional legitimacy. Once the legitimacy of the record itself is questioned, every party becomes nervous, including those with nothing to hide, because a nervous public does not differentiate carefully. The risk, therefore, is not only scandal, it is a chain reaction. A private mechanism becomes legible. Legibility becomes narrative. Narrative becomes revaluation. Revaluation becomes withdrawal. Withdrawal becomes litigation. Litigation becomes forced exposure. Forced exposure becomes rupture, financially, socially, and politically. In that sequence, the original question, how an obligation moved, almost becomes secondary. What matters is that the public learns the gate exists. That is why the system's response, when risk rises, is not to clarify. It is to reduce trace, not because clarification would be impossible in principle, but because clarification would require admitting that classification is power. And in 1896, admitting that publicly would invite exactly the outcomes. The era feared most: loss of credit, loss of standing, and the kind of legal visibility that turns private procedure into public contest. This block resolves one tension clearly. The arrangement did not need to be illegal to be catastrophic if exposed. The danger was the mismatch between the official narrative of fairness and the operational reality of access. The preparation for the next topic is therefore direct. If exposure would break confidence, the next rational action is not denial. It is removal of names, of pages, of correspondence, of anything that could allow a third party to reconstruct the mechanism with legal precision. The image that ends this section is simple and procedural. A newsroom desk with a draft headline that uses the words private settlement, while across town, a trust department filing room closes for the evening and a clerk turns a key in a cabinet, because in 1896, a locked drawer could be more stabilizing than a gold reserve statement. By October 2nd, 1897, the most revealing part of the case is no longer what the record says. It is what the record cannot say anymore, even when you know exactly where to look. This is the point in the investigation where the trail stops behaving like ordinary loss and starts behaving like directed absence. Not a fire, not a flood, not the slow decay of paper, something cleaner than that. Something that leaves the shelves intact while hollowing out the sequence. The entities that matter here are not grand in name, but they are decisive in function. An estate archive maintained through a private secretary's office and a trust department filing room that managed correspondence, schedules, and internal references that never belonged to public view. In the Golden Age, the public ledger was only the facade. The structure that supported it was private indexing, private custody, private rooms where paper traveled with fewer witnesses. If the risk described in 1896 was that the mechanism could become legible, then 1897 is what an institution does when it decides legibility is unacceptable. The action is concrete and it is administrative. It begins with retrieval. A clerk in a trust department does not destroy history in one dramatic act. The first step is always to locate what connects names to mechanisms, the letters that reference accommodation, the drafts that show the language swap, the internal notes that explain why an obligation was treated as classification rather than payment. In a filing room, those items are not stored as scandal. They are stored as routine, correspondence folders, committee packets, schedule envelopes, registry cross-references. The work of disappearance starts when someone with authority instructs that routine to be revised. The private secretary's office is where discretion becomes policy. An estate archive is not just a room. It is a controlled narrative. It holds invitations, philanthropic receipts, council letters, travel notes, and the quiet paperwork that keeps reputation smooth across decades. If a single name in a letter could connect a debtor to a trustee arrangement tied to gold collateral Takishun reserve accommodation, then that letter is not merely risky, it is radioactive. Not because it proves crime, but because it proves a gate, and gates, once seen, become political. So the process turns procedural. Pages are replaced, not ripped out in front of an audience. A carbon copy that should exist is missing from the expected place and appears, if it appears at all, in a different folder with less specific labeling. A letter that should have a reply has none, and the absence is too neat to be natural. A committee packet's cover sheet references attachments, but the attachment list is incomplete, and the numbering on the remaining pages suggests something once sat between them. This is the signature of document cleaning. Continuity preserved on the outside, continuity broken inside. In the trust department filing room, the effort is quieter still. A folder can be reclassified without leaving a public footprint. Closed, concluded, retired, inactive. These words can be used as labels, but labels do not have to map to reality. A file can be removed from a general cabinet into a restricted cabinet. A restricted cabinet can be accessed by fewer hands, and fewer hands means fewer memories. In a system built on institutional memory, restriction is not only security, it is attrition. The consequence becomes measurable in the only way such things can be measured, through secondary traces. This is not speculation, it is the mechanics of archives. When something is removed from an ordered system, the system often leaves behind artifacts of its former order, broken sequence numbers, index references that point to a destination that no longer resolves, margin notes that assume the existence of an enclosure, register entries that list a schedule identifier with no public filing, and now no private packet to explain it. These are not dramatic revelations, they are the cold geometry of absence, and that is why the void becomes verifiable. A lie can be argued about. A missing page can be dated by its surrounding context. An empty slot in a numbered run is not an opinion. It is a fact of discontinuity. The surviving fragments do not tell you what was removed, but they tell you removal occurred, and they tell you it occurred in a way consistent with controlled handling rather than random loss. The estate archive shows the same behavior, but with a different motivation. An estate's concern is legacy, inheritance, reputation, how the story reads to heirs, to society, to history. Trust departments are concerned with exposure, litigation, counterparties, solvency as perception. Those motivations converge when the same correspondence touches both worlds. A council letter about classification that also touches an old money name. That is the junction point where reputational risk becomes archival. Risk. There is an institutional logic to why 1897 is the year this hardens. The worst heat of the panic era has passed, but the memory of fragility has not. Markets and newspapers have learned what to look for. Oversight climates have matured into suspicion. A system that survived 1893 and its aftershocks understands that stability is not only liquidity, it is narrative control. The more the public discusses gold and confidence, the more dangerous it becomes to leave paper that can be reassembled into a single readable chain. What remains, therefore, is not a story, but a pattern of gaps. You find a reference to a correspondence file, but the correspondence is incomplete. You find an index line that implies a schedule, but the schedule is not where it should be. You find a numbering sequence in a trust packet that jumps as if a page once sat there and no longer does. You find a marginal notation that assumes an enclosure, C attached, yet nothing is attached. Each of these on its own could be dismissed. Together, they form the only kind of evidence that survives when institutions clean. Evidence of removal rather than evidence of content. This disappearance also produces a practical consequence that reaches beyond the archive. It hardens the hierarchy of who can challenge what. If the connecting tissue is gone, a creditor's discovery request becomes less precise. If the names are removed, a rival's attack becomes easier to dismiss as insinuation. If the mechanism is no longer legible, even an honest investigator is forced to speak in conditional language. In a system where power is partly the ability to demand proof, removing proof is not just defensive. It is strategic. The tension resolved in this block is clean. The danger of exposure described in 1896 is answered in 1897, not by argument, but by absence. The system does not refute. It curates, and this sets the stage for what comes next. Once a file becomes a verifiable void, the remaining clues are no longer full documents. They are anomalies, mismatched stamps, values that do not fit the expected coupon or fee, signatures placed where an annex should be, instrument numbers that skip as if something was rerouted. The next step in the investigation is not to find what was removed, because removal has already done its work. The next step is to interrogate what survived by accident or by design. The closing image is physical and plain. A filing room at the end of a corridor, a cabinet drawer, shut with a soft click and a folder label that still exists, while the pages that once justified it have already been replaced. The first thing to understand about an inconsistency in a late 19th century record is that it rarely appears as a confession. It appears as a refusal. The paper refuses to align with the system that produced it. Dates that should agree do not. A number that should proceed in sequence does not. A figure that should match a known coupon logic does not. These are not interpretive problems. They are mechanical problems, the kind that only exist when a process has been bent. The specific conflict that survives here is narrow enough to be named and stubborn enough to matter. A set of stamps that place the same instrument in two different administrative moments, 1896 and 1897, without offering a clean explanation for why. A document bears a clerk's received mark consistent with 1 year, while a notarial acknowledgement or witness attestation points to the other. In an ordinary filing life, that can happen with delayed recording, with represented copies, with an office backlog. But what makes this conflict refuse to fit is that the surrounding details behave as if the mismatch is doing work. It does not broaden clarity, it narrows it. The entities involved are not glamorous. They are functional roles that governed what became real in the record. A recording clerk in a Manhattan office and a notary or witness whose signature and seal turn private paper into admissible paper. In the Gilded Age, those roles were not merely bureaucratic, they were gates. When a clerk receives an instrument, assigns it a place in a book and stamps it, the system is saying, this exists in the public pathway. When a notary acknowledges signatures, the system is saying this can withstand scrutiny. A conflict between these marks is not a stylistic error. It is a structural ambiguity introduced into the object. The action in this block is a confrontation of particulars. You place the surviving pages side by side and you stop treating them as narrative. You treat them as artifacts. One stamp indicates an office receipt date in 1896, the kind of quick ink mark that belongs to intake. Another stamp or seal suggests a 1897 acknowledgement, an attestation that belongs to formalization. In a clean file, these moments would align: intake, acknowledgement, recording, indexing, cross-reference. Here, the sequence blurs, and the blur matters, because it changes what a third party can demand. If intake occurred in 1 year, but acknowledgement in another, what happened in between? Was there a revision? Was there a substitution? Was a page removed and reattached later? The record does not answer. It only shows the seam. Then there is the value that refuses to behave. The instrument references an amount associated with what earlier entries described as a gold collateral reserve accommodation. Yet the figure on a surviving note does not harmonize with what an expected coupon, fee, or accrual would suggest for that month. In ordinary bonds, you can predict the rhythm of money. In accommodations, you can predict the rhythm of fees and margins. The mismatch here is not that the number is unknown. It is that the number is incompatible with the kind of obligation it claims to be, unless something has been converted. This is where the earlier alteration becomes relevant without being repeated. Once language swaps repayment for set-off, assumption, or exchange into new instruments, the money becomes harder to read in a single line. That is the point. The surviving value behaves like it belongs to a different category than the text suggests. It looks like the residue of a conversion, an amount that would make sense if it were a netted figure after offsets, or if it were a balance after an exchange into a replacement instrument. But the public-facing paper does not announce conversion. It uses vague terms that allow the reader to assume closure without seeing mechanism. The most telling inconsistency is physical, not numerical, a signature positioned where an annex should be. In standard drafting practice, the last page carries signatures after schedules and exhibits are referenced and attached. Here, a signature block sits on a page that reads like it anticipates an attachment. Language that implies as per schedule, as herein annexed, as shown in the private schedule. But the annex is not present. Either the annex never existed, which contradicts the references, or it existed and was removed, which aligns with what the previous block established. Document cleaning that preserves labels while hollowing contents. A notary's seal in such a position becomes a tool of misdirection without requiring deception in the seal itself. A notary attests that a person appeared and acknowledged a signature. The notary does not certify that the attachment was included or that the instrument's internal cross-references are complete. That is not the notary's function. This is why the placement matters. It produces a document that is valid enough to travel while remaining incomplete enough to obstruct reconstruction. And then there is the numbering. Instruments that pass through county practice tend to leave numbering footprints, LIBOR and page references, docket identifiers, index codes, internal packet numbers. What survives here is a sequence that jumps. A clerk's notation references a prior instrument number that does not resolve. A later reference points to an instrument number that exists, but the intermediary numbers are absent. Again, in isolation, this could be backlog, or a different book, or a separate filing stream. But the pattern is consistent. The missing pieces are always the pieces that would connect the public entry to the private mechanism. This is where the inconsistency stops being a mere curiosity and becomes an investigative pivot. An honest error can produce confusion, but it usually produces confusion in all directions. It does not consistently reduce visibility. The mismatches here do not create random noise. They create selective fog. They leave just enough structure for an obligation to appear retired, removed, and just enough formal mark to protect against casual challenge while removing the exact connective tissue a public reviewer would require to prove how that retirement occurred. The practical consequence is legal and institutional. A creditor attempting to trace the chain would face ambiguity that delays and dilutes. A rival seeking to weaponize the record would find it frustratingly non-committal. An oversight climate that relies on clear filings would find nothing clean to seize. In a system where timing and proof determine who gets heard, ambiguity becomes defense by design. It buys time. It fractures certainty. It pushes disputes into a realm where only insiders, those with access to schedules, committee packets, and council correspondence, can speak with confidence. There is another consequence, quieter but equally real. It conditions the record to be treated as a performance. The public sees closure language. The public sees dates and seals. The public assumes ordinary process. Meanwhile, the people who understand the seam, the clerks, the council networks, the trust department hands who know what a complete packet should look like, learn the lesson that absence can be engineered without breaking. Formality, you do not have to falsify the system. You only have to use it in a way that creates non-recoverable pathways. This is why the stamp conflict matters. It is not simply that one stamp says 1896 and another implies 1897. It is that the conflict is attached to other misalignments, value logic, signature placement, numbering gaps that point toward a managed record rather than a messy one. The system did not collapse into disorder. It maintained its posture while altering what could be. Reconstructed. The tension resolved in this block is precise. The void from 1897 is no longer just an absence. It has edges. It has seams. It has marks that show where the file was forced to pass through official hands while remaining incomplete in exactly the ways that protect the mechanism from public tracing. And this prepares the next step directly. If an inconsistency like this survives, it can only survive because it becomes tolerable inside a process. A single irregular file is a risk. A repeatable vocabulary and repeatable routing make the risk disappear into routine. What follows, therefore, is not another missing page. It is the moment this kind of fog becomes a method, when clerks, council, and trust departments begin to label sensitive movements with standardized terms like restricted, maintenance, preservation, and by instruction, so that the gaps stop looking like anomalies and start looking like procedure. The closing image is simple and concrete. A stamped corner of paper under lamplight, two dates that should have matched, and a clerk's ledger line that points onward, away from public books into a schedule the public was never meant to see. By the time an inconsistency can be observed across more than one sheet, the deeper question is no longer what happened to a single file. The deeper question is what kind of organization allows that seam to exist without correction. In the 1890s, the marks that refused to align still looked like accidents. An intake stamp in 1 year, an acknowledgement in another, a signature sitting where an annex should have been. Those are the kinds of problems that invite inquiry. They are visible precisely because they look like mistakes. What changes at the turn of the century is not the existence of sensitive arrangements. Those had always existed. What changes is the language used to hold them. When a system learns that visibility is the danger, it begins to manage visibility as an administrative variable. And that is how a secret stops being an episode and becomes a process. The date that matters here is May 11th, 1901. It appears not as a dramatic turning point, but as the kind of date that would sit comfortably on a memorandum, a routine instruction, a line in an internal register. The entity is equally unromantic and therefore more important. Trust departments as a category, reinforced by the connective tissue of private clubs and council networks that carried shared habits across institutions, without requiring formal coordination. In the Gilded Age, trust department did not simply mean custodianship. It meant a controlled space where wealth could be administered through instruments that were technically lawful and practically unreachable. The action in this block is the standardization of phrasing. Not one phrase, but a family of phrases that do the same work. They keep a record alive while keeping its contents out of public reach. The words are plain: restricted, maintenance, preservation, by instruction, And that plainness is part of their strength. They do not announce a special circumstance, they declare a category. They make sensitivity sound like routine. To see what this does, you have to picture how a trust department actually handled paper. There were public-facing filings, and there were internal packets. There were instruments that belonged in county books, and there were schedules that lived behind a door, with access granted by title and by familiarity. There were minute books for committees, and there were council letters that were not minutes, not filings, and not meant for circulation. In the 1890s, the most vulnerable moment was transition, when something moved from one kind of paper to another, when an obligation was converted, offset, exchanged, or absorbed by arrangement. Transition created seams. Seams created evidence. By 1901, the solution is procedural. Reduce seams by moving details off the public pathway earlier and more cleanly. You do not remove the record entirely because absence can trigger suspicion. Instead, you keep the record and remove its explanatory anatomy. You write restricted, and that single word permits the omission of names, terms, collateral description, and routing. You write maintenance, and that permits continued administrative handling without any description of what is being maintained. You write preservation, and that permits a file to be kept without being opened, referenced without being described, protected without being made legible. You write by instruction, and you have invoked authority without identifying it. This is not an abstract evolution. It is the difference between a traceable event and a non-traceable one. In the earlier material, the investigator had something to press. A stamp conflict, a number that jumped, a signature placed where an attachment should have been. Those are mistakes only if the system still believes it owes you. Clarity. Standardization is how the system stops owing you clarity. It replaces mistakes with a vocabulary that anticipates the investigator and deprives him of leverage. In practice, the vocabulary operates like a split screen. On one side, the public registry can still show that something was retired, removed, satisfied, or closed. On the other side, the actual mechanism, how gold collateral was treated, what was netted, what was assumed, what was exchanged into what, moves into schedules that do not circulate publicly and do not need a public filing number. A schedule can be referenced without being filed. It can be held without being indexed. It can be maintained without being described. And if a later reviewer ever asks why the record is thin, the system can answer with its new language: restricted, preservation, by instruction. This is where the council networks matter. The same terms begin to appear across different houses, not because they are copied from one master rulebook, but because the same people move through the same rooms. The private clubs and the council circles of New York were not merely social ornaments. They were practical channels through which methods traveled. A council who has learned that a restricted notation prevents a later discovery fight will use it again. A trust officer who has learned that maintenance allows a file to remain active without exposure will recommend it again. A clerk who has learned which wording triggers fewer questions will adopt it again. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires professional memory. The consequence is institutional and measurable. Invisibility becomes replicable. The earlier record had seams because it was forced to improvise under pressure. The later record has fewer seams because it no longer improvises, it routinizes. The system builds a set of authorized evasions that remain within the surface rules of record keeping while hollowing out the public's ability to Reconstruct economic truth that has legal consequences. A creditor seeking clarity must now pierce not a single anomaly, but a whole category of administrative designation. A court can order production of documents, but it cannot order existence. If the operative terms were placed in a private schedule that never entered the public route has nothing to produce. The file can be referenced, the transaction can be real, the obligation can be converted, and yet the public-facing chain remains clean enough to withstand casual challenge. It also has social consequences, which mattered in the Gilded Age more than many modern observers admit. Reputation did not depend only on solvency, it depended on the appearance of solvency and the absence of legible favoritism. If the public could see that gold access operated as a gate, it would become a political argument, not merely a financial one. It would move from counting houses into newspapers. It would provoke questions about fairness and about whether the Treasury Reserve existed for the public or for a network. In that climate, the safest record is not the most accurate one. It is the one that cannot be easily argued against. This is the institutional moral of normalization. When the vocabulary of restriction becomes routine, the boundary between record-keeping and governance dissolves. The record is no longer merely an account of what happened. It is a tool for managing what can be said about what happened. And by 1901, the system has learned to do this with a pen rather than with an eraser. A gap produced by erasure is suspicious. A gap produced by procedure is ordinary. There is a final, quieter consequence that will matter for the next stage of this investigation. Once restricted becomes a category, it survives technological change. You can microfilm a restricted register, you can digitize a preserved file, you can publish an index that references a schedule. None of those acts resurrect the content that never entered the public chain. They only modernize the surface layer of the same controlled architecture. So the tension resolved here is not whether the mechanism existed, it is how the mechanism learned to hide in plain administrative sight. The language becomes the lock, the process becomes the door. And once the door is built into routine, future access becomes a question of permission, not evidence. The closing image is concrete. A trust department notation in neat hand, dated May 11th, 1901, with a single word, restricted, written where explanation should have been, and a second note beneath it, smaller, colder, almost apologetic. Details held in private schedule, by instruction. The note dated May 11th, 1901 does not read like a confession. It reads like a procedure. That is precisely why it matters now. A confession is a moment. A procedure is a design. And designs survive their own era, not because anyone keeps repeating the original intent, but because the method becomes normal, teachable, and easy to defend as how things are done. In the present, the first instinct is to assume that technology corrects the asymmetry. We are told that archives are opening, ledgers are being scanned, indexes are being cross-linked. County records that once demanded travel, time, and permission are now searchable, zoomable, and reproducible. The public archive in its digital form looks like a democratizing force. It can be, but only within a boundary that the Gilded Age system understood long before computers. Access expands what exists on the record. It does not resurrect what was never allowed onto it. The date that clarifies this is 2008. Not because the modern crisis is identical to the monetary tensions of the 1890s, but because the crisis of 2008 exposed a familiar distinction in public life. The difference between what is officially visible and what is operationally decisive. When markets seized and institutions scrambled to stabilize confidence, the public was offered narratives in the language it could recognize. Meanwhile, the mechanisms that actually routed survival, credit lines, collateral terms, private guarantees, off-balance arrangements, side agreements, were often handled in channels that were not designed for public reconstruction. That distinction is not an accusation. It is a structural observation about how power behaves under stress. The entities in this block are not villains and not heroes. They are categories that define what can be known. Public archive digitization efforts on one side and modern private capital structures on the other. The first is driven by ideals of preservation and access. The second is driven by confidentiality, leverage, and negotiated control. The tension between them is not new. It is a direct continuation of the Trust Department vocabulary that matured by 1901. The words have changed, the logic has not. The action here is concrete. Digitization makes the surviving record easier to read, but it does not change what the record contains. It makes an index entry more searchable, but it cannot produce the schedule referenced by that entry if the schedule was never filed publicly. It can present a photographed page of a county book, but it cannot photograph the missing page that was replaced before microfilm ever existed. It can standardize metadata, but it cannot create metadata for documents that were never entered into the public chain of custody. This is why the 1901 vocabulary is more than atmosphere. Restricted was not a dramatic label, it was an administrative one. It told the system where to store detail so that the detail would remain real without becoming legible. In modern form, the equivalents are familiar to anyone who has watched high-stakes finance operate: confidential, private placement, side letter, data room access by invitation, non-disclosure, terms subject to negotiation, not for public distribution. They are not inherently improper. They are simply the contemporary version of an old institutional decision, the decision to make certain truths operational but not reconstructible. If you go looking for a 19th century private schedule today, what do you find? Not a locked drawer in a trust department filing room, but an empty space where a public reference points away from the public path. The absence is modernized, not repaired. In the best cases, a digitized index will tell you that an instrument existed, was amended, was satisfied, was replaced, was assigned. The digitization can even preserve the handwriting that marks the decision. But when the detail was displaced into a private annex, held by instruction, the digitized record becomes a clearer photograph of the limitation, not an escape from it. There is a second problem, quieter and more damaging to reconstruction. Digitization creates a new sense of completeness. When a person sees thousands of scanned pages, searchable databases, and curated collections, the mind assumes the system is now whole. The reality is that digitization can make a partial archive feel total. It makes what survived feel like everything that mattered. The Gilded Age institutions understood this kind of psychological effect without describing it in modern terms. They did not need to. They only needed to ensure that the public-facing record was coherent enough to stand on its own. Coherence is not truth. It is the minimum condition required to prevent inquiry from becoming leverage. In 2008, the official story was filled with terms that were public-facing by design: liquidity facilities, capital injections, stabilization measures. Those are real. But the decisive layers often lived in documents that were not meant for the public to pass in real time. Negotiated terms, collateral schedules, covenants, waivers, private assurances. Even years later, many of the most operational details remain dispersed across confidential agreements, private legal files, or negotiated disclosures that do not assemble themselves into a single public narrative. This is the same logic that governed the gold standard's practical power after 1893. The official claim is uniformity, a standard applied to everyone. The operational reality is conditional, access determined by proximity to reserves, credibility networks, and the institutions that could convert promises into survival. In the 1890s, the line was a metaphor for credit priority, but it was also physical: doors, offices, endorsements, committee decisions. In 2008, the line is still real. It is drawn through counterparty relationships, collateral eligibility, the ability to roll funding, the ability to negotiate terms away from public scrutiny. The public sees the outcome. The mechanism remains a set of agreements that do not circulate as a single file. This is where the consequence becomes institutional. The official narrative remains clean, and the gap becomes a form of power. A clean narrative is not necessarily false. It is simply incomplete in a particular direction. It omits the part of the story that would show how advantage is structured. And when the missing part is missing by design, when it never entered the registrable pathway, contesting the narrative becomes difficult even for serious investigators. You can point to what exists, you can cite what survived, but the most decisive terms may have been held in a form that is not accessible without consent. That is the modern inheritance of the Gilded Age record-keeping system. We often speak of the past as though it is gone, as though its influence survives only in architecture and portraits and names on plaques. Yet the more enduring artifacts are often procedural. The way wealth preserved itself, through council networks, through trust departments, through controlled documentation, did not disappear when mansions were converted into museums. It adapted. It became legal infrastructure. It became financial infrastructure. It became standard professional practice. None of this requires an accusation of a hidden hand. It requires a sober acknowledgement of what institutions are optimized to do, when reputational risk is existential, and when markets punish uncertainty, systems learn to control legibility. They learn to make the record adequate for authority, not adequate for reconstruction. They learn to satisfy the requirements that matter most, the ones enforced by insiders, courts, and counterparties, not the ones imagined by the public. So the present connection is not that 2008 was the same as 1893. The present connection is that both moments reveal a hierarchy of visibility. In both moments, what is legible to the public is not identical to what is decisive behind closed doors. And digitization, for all its genuine value, does not abolish that hierarchy. It sharpens the boundary around it. The block ends with a concrete image, not a slogan, a modern web interface displaying a digitized county index from Manhattan, the entry crisp and searchable, the handwriting enlarged to the point where you can see the pressure of the pen. The line reads as it always did: retired, removed, satisfied, followed by a reference that leads nowhere public. See private schedule. You can click everything that exists. You cannot click what was never entered. And the screen, bright and clean, becomes the contemporary version of the 1901 notation. Access, not resurrection, setting the final stage for what the institution can truthfully claim and what it never had to record at all. In the last frame of our record, the screen is clean, the ink is legible, and the entry is searchable. Retired. Removed. See private schedule. A modern interface built to widen access ends by pointing you back toward what access can never reach. The document does not lie. It simply stops where the system trained it to stop. By January 1st, 1910, that training had matured into something quieter than a scheme and sturdier than a habit. It became administration. Not the administration of truth, but the administration of legibility. The named entity in this story is not a single bank, not a single man, not even a single trust company. It is the record-keeping system itself, county offices, trustees, and the elite council networks that taught institutions what could be safely written, what should be moved, and what must remain elsewhere. Because debt in these halls rarely vanishes. It changes its clothing. It is converted into a new instrument. It is reclassified under a different heading. It is displaced into a schedule that is real, but not public. It is recast in legal language that sounds final while preserving the underlying obligation as structure. A line item disappears, and in its place emerges an arrangement: set-off, assumption, conversion, exchange, terms that do not announce themselves as erasure, but function as a relocation of visibility. That is the action we can state without embellishment. The obligation survives by being rewritten into forms that do not circulate where ordinary verification occurs. What looks to the outside world like a settlement is often the result of documentation being made compliant with reputation rather than compliant with public reconstruction. And the consequence is not only financial, it is institutional. When visibility becomes political, satisfaction can be an administrative outcome rather than a transparent economic event. The archive is not merely a witness, it is a stage and at times an instrument. This is why the Gilded Age remains so instructive, not because its scandals were larger, but because its methods were refined. It was an era of beaux-arts certainty on the surface and procedural discretion underneath. Doors closed softly, papers were filed precisely, and what needed to persist did so, often without ever needing to defend itself in daylight. So we end where the investigation began, with a record that survives and with a trail that does not complete itself. If the record is curated, the absence is also evidence, just written in a language most people never learn. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. If this story resonated with you, let us know, because it tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. The corridor narrows, the light thins, a clerk's stamp dries in place, a ledger is returned to its shelf, not slammed, but set down with the weight of routine, and somewhere behind the public catalogue, behind retired, behind removed, behind C private schedule, another file remains intact, not because it was protected by secrecy alone, but because it was protected by procedure. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.